Finally. After making Five Nights at Freddy's lore videos for going on 2.5 years, I've officially fully read every single published FNAF book. Well, except for like the Freddy files and some of the game guides, but we're talking the Silver Eyes, Fazbear Frights, Tales from the Pizzaplex, the Character Encyclopedia, the Security Logbook, and the Cookbook. But the main reason for why I just finished were always the Fazbear Frights novels, or rather the short story collections. Up until now, I'd only read a couple of the stories within and all of the epilogues. I figured that was kind of the most important stuff in it and left the rest for when I would have time for it. But when making this timeline, I thought it would be necessary to finally read the rest of them, even if I don't think they're important on the surface. But now that I've fully read every single short story from Fazbear Frights, I get it. I understand why some people want the entire Fazbear Frights series to be canon and in continuity of the games. Again, they're all canon, but like within the game's timeline. But is it? I'm not so sure. Regardless, there is a lot of meaningful and important lore in this series. So much so that I don't even think I can get it all in one video. I'm going to try my damnedest, but worst case scenario, it might be a two-parter. We'll find out when we get there. I, as of writing this, don't know. As of recording this, I do, but I'll leave it as a surprise. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Now to begin, we should again go over Scott and canonicity and continuity and all those terms, but briefly this time. I had a whole spiel on how Scott uses the term canon and how he treats continuities and confirmations in the last book video about Silver Eyes. So if you want the full explanation, go watch that video. But briefly, very briefly, Scott considers all official FNAF products to be canon. The question then becomes which continuities are one and the same, or which continuities interact with each other. Look to the film as a non-controversial example of that. Obviously, the Five Nights at Freddy's movie, while pretty great, is not in the same continuity as the games. There's just too many inconsistencies. They're both separate timelines within the same or similar world. But the FNAF movie is still useful to figure out lore and questions that we might have for the games based on the logic that the movie uses. So what about the Fazbear Frights books? Well, Scott did actually make a direct statement on if these books tie into the games while they were coming out. Scott made a major update post thread on Steam back in 2018 for all the upcoming projects for Five Nights at Freddy's, and in it he mentions the Fazbear Frights books, in which he says, quote, "It will be a collection of short horror stories that take place in the FNAF universe. The series will launch with 5 books, each containing 3 different short stories with unique characters and plotlines, some connected directly to the games and some not." This is ultimately unhelpful. It's good to know that some of these stories will be directly connected to the games, and some won't be, but of course he doesn't specify which ones. And possibly most frustrating of all, the words he uses are directly connected, which theoretically could be interpreted in different ways. What does he mean by directly connected? Are some of these short stories literally exactly things that occurred in the game's timeline? Or by directly connected, does he mean that some characters are directly connected to characters in game, or that some characters from the games are directly in the books and vice versa? Because there are some characters that we have direct evidence stating this is a character from the games, that being William Afton, but is it the game's version of William Afton? After all, the Silver Eyes is directly connected to FNAF because it's got William Afton and the Fazbear animatronics and the Funtime animatronics, so that's a direct connection, but the story isn't by a long shot. Ultimately, we're going to have to take it case by case. So for now, we'll do a similar thing that we did for the Silver Eyes novels. More so looking for general rules and things that would make sense to cross over, and if there's any really important things, then we'll mention those as we go. But there are several characters that, whether or not they're in the games, I think are relevant and important to bring up, and we will touch on them. So it's probably best to start with the kind of focus of all of the epilogues and much of the stories of Fazbear Frights. What do these books tell us about Agony beyond power of speech? Agony is an interesting concept in Five Nights at Freddy's, one that a lot of people have heard of, but I have a feeling a good chunk of the fandom knows realistically nothing about, and fair. It's sort of a dark reflection of Remnant, and that's not entirely accurate, but it's a good touchstone if you remember anything from this video. It doesn't work in the same way as Remnant either, so maybe it's not that useful. Now, the games did introduce the concept of a dark remnant in FNAF AR, and most people, myself included, believe this is in reference to Agony. And while that makes sense, FNAF AR treats Remnant weird and strangely in general. It's established in the Silver Eyes and in Fazbear Frights that Remnant is specifically the mixture of metal and spirits or memories or something. So it's typically a liquid mercury kind of substance. So when you get to FNAF AR and it's just this glowing mote of light, something seems off. Regardless, the Frights books don't delve too much into specific applications of Agony, other than its two main uses that we can see. The main direct information we get on Agony comes from Phineas Taggart, a scientist in the epilogues. Well, technically he dies before the epilogues start, but two of the epilogues are a backstory and flashback of him, making the Stitch Wraith. What is the Stitch Wraith? Hold on, we'll get to it. Probably in this video. Maybe. Taggart was a pharmaceutical worker to make money, but his passion and life was devoted to emotional energy research. And all of his spare time and money went into researching this phenomena. I feel like this quote best summarizes his personality and beliefs in regards to Agony. Quote, "Extreme human emotions appear to impact its surroundings far more powerfully the more negative it is. Agony, I'm convinced, radiates farther from people than any other emotion. Love has its influence, but the experiments being done with water crystals have been misinterpreted. Just because love forms beautiful ice crystals doesn't mean it's the most powerful emotion. Yesterday, I mimicked the ice crystal methodology, and by allowing all the hurt and anger I usually keep well in check to burst forth, I watched water manifest a hideous crystal in a matter of seconds." When reading this quote, you get the sense that he believes Agony is much stronger than Remnant, a material most often associated with positive emotions, like love, for example. And that assumption is backed up by other things. He continues to say, "I'm convinced that Agony has a greater energetic radius and power than any other emotion." So we know that Agony is essentially the energy radiating from the most negative human emotion. But what does that mean? What does this energy do? What does it look like? Well, he goes on to say his hypothesis is, quote, "You can take a saturation of Agony, add any kind of intelligence, even an artificial one, and they will combine together to transmute the energy of emotion into the energy of physical action. This, I believe, is what explains what people call haunted objects." So in this sense, it does work similarly to Remnant. In the Silver Eyes, Remnant was injected into robots already programmed to obey William Afton, so that when they were powered up and given a sort of life, William Afton had direct control over them. Taggart tries to do a similar experiment with Agony. He had been collecting any artifact that people said were haunted, specifically ones surrounded with negative emotions and energy, hoping that these items would already have Agony in them. And finally, his last shipment arrived: a stack of paper plates, a empty jack-in-the-box, a mirror that witnessed a man kill his entire family, and one old broken up endoskeleton. He did some minor repairs to the endoskeleton and then began his experiment, wherein he had a machine that took the Agony from the first item and poured it into the second item, and then it took the Agony from the second item and the first item, pouring it into the third, and finally, when the third item had the Agony of the previous two, he pours all of that Agony into the endoskeleton. While he was doing this, he does make an interesting note. I don't know if it's ultimately helpful in any way, but I thought it was worth mentioning. He says, quote, "The transfer of emotional energy occurred at a frequency the human eye could not discern. If Phineas turned out all the lights and used a blue light, he could detect just a bit of the energy flow. He discovered, however, that blue light tended to distort the field. It seems like Agony is very slightly visible in its energetic state if blue lights are used. However, it can apparently distort the Agony. This is particularly interesting to me, because as far as we know, Remnant is the mixture of metal and soul, or metal and spirit, or metal and memory. It depends on who you ask. But as far as the actual spirit therein, you can't see that, unless maybe that's what we're seeing in FNAF AR. As far as we're aware, Remnant-possessed objects, and even objects made entirely from Remnant metal, are just like really shiny, not necessarily like perceptible to be possessed by something. Anyway, once all of the Agony was in the endoskeleton, he did something a little silly. Now, I'm going to say a lot of words and names and things. Ideally, I get to them in this video. If not, you're gonna just have to believe me, and I'll go way more in depth in the next video. But hear me out. He takes the endoskeleton and wants to give it a essentially face and heart, or a mind and a body. So he takes the battery from the fetched dog toy and puts it into its chest. He then takes the mask of the Simon doll and puts it on its face. And suddenly, it stirs up as if it were alive. Taggart's experiment was ultimately a success. It worked. Unfortunately for him, he is an idiot. Like an incredibly intelligent dude, just kind of stupid. Like this guy who wants to play, but I don't like playing with my hands. Because you hurt. What if I baby you? What if you're just a baby? Yeah, think about it for 1 second, because apparently he didn't. His entire experiment was to make a man-sized endoskeleton, fill it with as much agony as physically possible, and then give it sentience. Of course, the first thing that it would do is kill him instantly. And it does. It touches him, and he basically shrivels up and dies immediately. When somebody goes to check on him, his body is almost mummified. His eyes rolled to the back of their sockets and black liquid coming out. We can assume, however, since this happened multiple times, one of the effects of strong points of agony is instant horrific death, and it can also possess things much like Remnant. So again, to summarize, the main 2 things we see Agony do is possess objects much like Remnant and instantly kill things. But that's not all. Agony also seems to be able to manifest physical black tendrils, as both Eleanor, someone we will talk about, and the Afton amalgamation had them kind of sticking out when there was enough agony around. And we also get one more seeming ability of Agony, that being mental entrapment. Eleanor, and to an extent Andrew, characters we will talk about, are able to trap people in the worst versions of their memories, and even include some of their own memories in the process. Eleanor does this to a detective, and while he's in this weird state, in the real world only a few seconds go by, but in his perspective, a long time passes. But reaching into memories is not exclusive to Agony, because fittingly, Remnant has a similar ability. So let's talk about what we learn about Remnant in these books, shall we? Now, from the Silver Eyes video, we know that Remnant is able to give life to animatronics and other objects that it's injected into. We also know that the Remnant is directly connected to the spirits and memories of the person it's coming from. Essentially, in the Silver Eyes, William Afton takes the animatronics that the dead kids are inside of and melts it into one big heaping mass and keeps it in a sort of molten state. William then takes some of that molten metal mixture out and injects it into various animatronics, making them more powerful and almost sentient. It does seem notable, however, that the more Remnant is split up, the less control and memory that spirit has over that Remnant. We get some hints of this in the Silver Eyes, but a very clear example I think of this is the Stitch Wraith. We'll get more into the specifics of what makes up the Stitch Wraith when we cover it, but keep in mind that there are 2 spirits within the Stitch Wraith, and both of them have a very hard time remembering their past. And I believe this tracks with what we know about Remnant. If there's only a little bit of Remnant left, there's only a little bit of that memory left. That being said, we also know Remnant has some sort of healing properties. After all, Carlton is essentially given metaphoric Remnant by the Missing Child Incident kids, and there was Remnant injected directly into his heart, but he survived. So something had to be healed there. As far as the Fazbear Frights goes, we do get some extra uses of Remnant, but the most direct information comes from the end of the epilogues. The only scientist that directly gives us information on it, Dr. Talbert. And yes, I'm so annoyed that Taggart and Talbert are the 2 important doctors here. Very hard to keep track of. And quick side note, for those who know, this is the only context in which I will talk about something named Talbert on this channel. If you know, you know. Anyway, when the detective of the epilogues asks Dr. Talbert about what he thinks Remnant is, he responds, quote, "It's like the metal is haunted. It's more complicated than that, of course, but it's similar to the way that water conducts electricity. Remnant is the mixing of the tangible with the intangible, of memory with the present, the people and things that are lost. It makes them almost real again." So this is a more specific and nuanced interpretation of Remnant, and it makes a lot of sense with what we know about Agony. Talbert seems to be suggesting that Remnant is specifically metal possessed by positive memories and spirit, Remnant being the silvery metal liquid that we can visibly see, and you can inject it into other objects and make objects fully out of it, which we'll talk about very soon. The actual spirit or memory or positive emotion involved isn't Remnant. It's just within the conduit of metal, much like electricity and water, like he says. If we're talking about that metaphor, we're talking about electrified water. We're not talking about electricity, we're talking about electrified water. So with Remnant, we're not talking about the specific spirit within the metal, we're talking about the combination. So, similar to Agony, could we ascribe an emotion to this energy? I think we can. I think we can ascribe love to it. That makes a lot of sense. But the book never directly states that. It's just a common hypothesis in the fandom. That being said, clarification is great and all, but do we get any other additional abilities Remnant has that we can see demonstrated in these books? And quite a lot, actually. Interestingly enough, in the very first Fazbear Frights novel, there's a story called To Be Beautiful. This story is really creepy and kind of fucked. Essentially, a girl finds the Eleanor doll in the trunk of a car at a dump, takes it out, thinks it's beautiful, but it's kind of banged up. So she brings it home, cleans it off, and in repayment, Eleanor promises one wish, and the girl's wish is to be beautiful. So Eleanor just says to put on a silver heart pendant that she has. She gives it to the girl, and she says, you must wear this and never ever take it off. And every morning, you'll wake up a little more beautiful. And it works. Every time she wakes up, she perceives herself as more beautiful, and other people start to recognize her as such. It's revealed at the end of the story that this pendant is making her look more beautiful. And once it falls off, she's not just what she used to be. She is a heaping pile of scrap and mechanics barely held together. And in her run back home, she can't get the pendant back on and eventually falls in the garage, finding bags of chopped up body parts. It's revealed that Eleanor had been slowly replacing bits of her body with machinery, and the pendant was just making her look more beautiful. Eleanor takes the pendant from her and looks like the girl originally did, and then leaves, essentially replacing her in the neighborhood. This seems to show Remnant having two major abilities. One, it functions similar as an illusion disc, where the body of this girl is being replaced by machinery and metal, but everyone just sees her as normal, which in illusion disc would work similarly, having a base that kind of vaguely looks like what you're going for, and then changing it to what it should look like. Although admittedly, this seems much more powerful in effect than illusion discs. After all, illusion discs typically make people feel like violently ill when they're first exposed to it, and this, nobody seemed to be affected. Furthermore, it seemed to be keeping her alive in a sense. I never specified this. The pendant she's wearing is made out of pure remnant metal. Dr. Talbert made it for his daughter, and then it ended up in Eleanor's hands, but it's literally a pendant purely made out of remnant. Anyway, back to the pendant. The moment that she takes the pendant off, she starts falling apart and dying. It seems like that pendant was not only keeping her together, but keeping her alive despite how little of herself was still there. The books also present two other abilities that are completely new to us, specifically from the Stitch Wraith. After one of the stingers, which again, I will get to. There's just a lot, and there's no good order to talk about this stuff. In one of the stingers, all of the agony is taken out of the Stitch Wraith, along with one of the spirits of it. So after that, the Stitch Wraith is just one spirit, and the only energy inside of it seems to be Remnant. In this state, we see the Stitch Wraith do some very interesting things. For one, he's able to burn away an agony infection on a detective and heal him in a sort of way. This could just be temperature, but it seems like Remnant is involved here. More specifically though, he's able to reach into the memories of people he touches and find positive ones, enlarging them in their mind. He does this to a homeless man to help him find peace, and he then does it to several souls in a ball pit, the Into the Pit ball pit, to help them rest. They don't move on, but they can at least find peace in where they're at by reminding them of good times and getting them out of the horrible nightmares they were in. So that's Remnant and Agony, but is there any other kind of possession in the Fazbear Frights books? Well, there's two that come to mind. The first one is likely a byproduct of Remnant, but I feel it pertinent to bring up. It's a more direct version of a person being possessed in the final book in the series, 12, Felix the Shark. Specifically the story, You're the Band. And again, I know that technically these are scrapped stories that did not make the final cut, so their actual official nature is dubious at best. But when a story is about a boy being possessed by putting on the actual head of Freddy Fazbear, and then a night guard from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza named Mike protects him and his mother from the marionette, I'm gonna talk about that story. Essentially, it's exactly what I said. A kid puts on the real animatronic head of Freddy, and then he starts acting weird and describing the missing child incident victims. He sees his grandfather pick up a knife and just like instinctively attacks him and says like, I have to protect the others. And his mom's like, that's fucking weird. And eventually he's led to a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Now, Mike, the night guard, stops his mom and says, hey, look, I think it's that mask making him do weird stuff. You can help me, but we gotta do this fast. They get to Freddy's, and he's literally on stage with Bonnie and Chica. And suddenly, black and white tendrils start coming out of everywhere. The marionette is trying to get the mask too. Mike takes the mask, puts it on the kid, takes it off, and gives it back to them. The kid is safe. Once the marionette gets the Freddy head back and puts it back on Freddy, the marionette retreats, seemingly only trying to protect the band, and everyone goes home happy. So again, this is a wild story, and I think it is worthwhile in bringing up the psyche and personality of Michael Afton, and it's definitely not in the game's timeline, but it's interesting to note this does back up the idea of the FNAF 2 nightmares being because Michael is putting on a Freddy mask in the FNAF 2 location, and then Gabriel, the spirit most likely inside Freddy, is the one giving us those FNAF 2 nightmares from the perspective of Freddy. Not sure though. Regardless, there is one other kind of possession in these books. Well, not possession per se, but more than a few times, something is just willed to turn into something else. And interestingly enough, one of these instances might actually be really relevant to the lore of the games. So let's talk about Kids at Play. To sum up a very strange story as quickly as I can, Kids at Play follows a man named Joel, who near the beginning of the story runs over a Kids at Play sign. It's not revealed until the end of the story, but they were put out by the Fazbear company to promote safe driving. It's about a 3-foot tall sign in the shape of a child with, a very basic shape. It's like a circular head, a big open mouth, and 2 black circles for eyes, holding up a sign that says Kids at Play. The one he hit has a weird brown puddle in front of it that reminds him of a disintegrated dog for some reason. Oh, okay, I almost made it. But regardless, he shrugs it off and drives away. But later, speeding again, he just hits a kid straight off the road into a ditch, which is crazy. But not wanting to have the rest of his life ruined, he just kind of speeds off and hopes nobody finds out it was him. But the next day, the lady who runs the donut shop that him and his dad go to is distraught because her 5-year-old son never came home. So they all agree to help the search party in looking for the son. And Joel specifically avoids that area because if the kid is alive, he can snitch on him. But throughout the whole time after hitting the kid and throughout all of this search party, he keeps getting more and more paranoid, seeing smaller and sometimes bigger versions of the Kids at Play sign popping up all over the place. And eventually, at the peak of his paranoia, he wakes up in the middle of the night, and even though he's fully resisting and screaming internally, his body, without his consent, walks all the way to where he hit the kid, and along the way is contorting and pieces are falling off of him, until finally he gets at the street corner where he hit that kid, and his body starts crumbling and contorting apart. Fingers fall off, teeth fall out, flesh ribbons off. It's a horrific, it's described for like 4 pages. It's a rough read, but eventually his consciousness just succumbs. The next morning, the police chief finds a somewhat larger and weirdly shaped Kids at Play sign at the scene of the crime. And when he stops to look at it, he notices a pile of brown and pink ribbons with some ooze and liquid in front of it. A bit off, but he takes a moment to look at the remaining trees to make sure nothing's wrong, and that's when he hears the kid crying for help. The kid was found, and everything is all right, except for Joel, but I guess he hit him, so fuck that guy. So yeah, the story is Joel hits a Kids at Play sign, and then he hits a kid, and then he gets so paranoid that eventually he wakes up and his body forces itself to that location and just turns into a Kids at Play sign. It's kind of like a new age Telltale Heart, where somebody does something horrible and then the paranoia of doing it leads them to go crazy until they eventually, in a way, turn themselves in. But why am I bringing up this wild story? Well, I had a terrifying thought. Bake with me for a second. I really don't think this is likely. It's really, really unlikely, but I gotta put it out there. Just put it out into the ether. These books have established that somehow, through Agony, or maybe the signs just do that, I don't know. They don't explain why this happens, but they do show that these signs can force you to become one of them. And it's not just Joel. The sign at the beginning of the book also had a weird, disintegrated, organic-looking pile of brown in front of it. So this has happened at least one other time, seemingly. So the book is showing us this is a thing that can happen. So are there any signs in the games, particularly yellow hazard signs, that have some weird semblance of life? I know, it's crazy, but like, what if? It's not impossible. Is that what the all-staff meeting was? All right, now that we've tackled all the different kinds of possession, we should start moving on to the characters I think are most important to bring up. But we're over 3,000 words in the script and then some, so this is unfortunately going to have to be it for today. I said a 2-parter was possible, so you can't say you're surprised, all right? So for now, what do you think about this lore that the books present? Did I miss any specific aspects about Remnant or Agony, or do you think there's still points of confusion we need cleared up. What about the sign thing? I don't know. But if you want my opinion on a different book series, you can go 2 weeks back and I did a video on the Silver Eyes novels and all the lore that I think is relevant from there. You can see that video right here. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to use #RideTart. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers. And until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.